Game difficulty is probably the most important element of a game's design. It's the spark that drives us, the challenge that makes us want to play in the first place. It appeals to our fundamental human desire to accomplish and overcome. And it reminds us of what makes gaming special, that our skill directly determines the outcome of events. Difficulty is also something that gamers take very seriously. In fact, I've probably seen more arguments about difficulty than any other element of game design. It kind of makes you wonder, right? Like, what is it about difficulty that's so particularly polarizing? And why are there so many different opinions on how to create satisfying difficulty? Well, that's the question for today, so let's jump right in. The most obvious reason for this disparity of opinions is that people have different skills, and that affects what games they find difficult. This is doubly impacted by how different genres of games require radically different skill sets. For example, someone who's fantastic at twitch shooters like CSGO or Unreal Tournament might not be as great at grand strategy games like Civilization or Crusader Kings. However, while this explains why every game isn't suitable for every player, it doesn't really explain why proper difficulty is debated even within specific genres and subgenres. For instance, while many action RPG fans hold up Dark Souls difficulty as a pinnacle of design, many other action RPG fans disagree and feel Dark Souls difficulty is cheap and artificial. This term, artificial difficulty, is something you'll hear a lot in these kinds of discussions. Artificial difficulty generally describes challenges that feel tacked on, overly based on luck, or otherwise unfair in some way. If that definition sounds ambiguous, that's because it is, and I think that's part of the problem. To some people, artificial difficulty means gimmicky stat changes that simply boost enemy damage or reduce player health but don't affect the game's core mechanics, like enemy AI. To others, artificial difficulty means poorly telegraphed obstacles, like hidden enemies or traps that the player can't anticipate, even if they're paying close attention. My belief is that these definitions are an oversimplification of a more complex issue. Let me tell you a story. When I was a kid, I didn't really like Sonic the Hedgehog. All my friends loved it, and there were things I liked about it, like the wonderful art and music, but to me, it seemed like a game about going fast that punished me for going fast.
Oh no!
It felt like every time I'd pick up speed and start to enjoy myself, I'd run into some spike or robot that I couldn't anticipate because of the game's small viewing area and lack of visual tells. I compared it to other games I liked, like Mega Man, where enemies always telegraph their attacks and environmental obstacles are rolled out gradually, giving you a chance to understand the challenge before you had to react to it. Mega Man's difficulty felt deliberate and balanced, while Sonic's difficulty felt cheap and unfair by contrast. It wasn't until years later that I realized I was way off base and guilty of a cardinal critical sin. See, unlike Mega Man's difficulty, which is mostly about quick reactions and twitch skill, Sonic's difficulty comes from trial and error, or in another sense, exploration, planning, and execution. Instead of following a relatively linear path, like in Mega Man or Mario, Sonic levels usually feature several different paths that often overlap and intersect. And while you might nail it the first time through, chances are you'll have to memorize the level layout and enemy locations if you want a clean run. This creates a very satisfying difficulty curve, where the time you spend exploring and planning directly determines the efficiency of your execution. It's a tried and true formula found in tons of games, but I failed to appreciate it because I was too busy punishing Sonic for deviating from a design it never intended in the first place. The purpose of this example is 1, to demonstrate how easy it is to misjudge a game when comparing it to other games, and 2, to show how a difficulty model that works well in one game may not necessarily work for another, even if those games are ostensibly very similar. This also works in reverse, with bad difficulty. Remember when we said increasing enemy damage was artificial? Well, that may be true for a game like Skyrim, where the player can restore their health by scarfing down 70 cheese wheels whenever they want. But making the same change in a survival game like Resident Evil or The Last of Us results in a more immersive and dangerous experience, where healing items are even more important and death is only ever a couple hits away. The change in each game was the same, but the end result is very different. It's also important to note that not everyone finds the same types of difficulty enjoyable. For instance, let's take a look at Call of Duty's hardest setting, also known as Veteran. The principal change when playing on Veteran is that the enemy AI focuses almost exclusively on the player, as opposed to the player's AI teammates. They'll bombard your position with a continuous stream of grenades. And if you peek out from cover, they'll immediately start shooting at you, even if your friends are more exposed. Now, if you remember, changing enemy AI is supposed to be one of the good ways of increasing difficulty, but is this the case? Do Veteran Mode's AI changes create a more satisfying experience? The answer is that, well, it depends. Some people say no, that getting Robocopped the second you peek out from cover is frustrating and unrealistic. Others say that Veteran Mode is supposed to be frustrating, and the greater challenge results in a greater feeling of satisfaction when the challenge is completed. Neither camp is right or wrong, they just have a difference of opinion, and in discussions about difficulty, that's usually what it boils down to. The takeaway from all this is that whether we're talking about enemy AI, stat changes, telegraphed attacks, or what have you, it's hard to describe any difficulty model as objectively good or bad, since that depends largely on context and player preference. Also, I think it's important as fans and critics to evaluate games on an individual basis, because as we found, games are complex, and what works in one may not work in another. I'm not saying we shouldn't compare games at all, of course, just that maybe we should be wary when typecasting games with other games they resemble. After all, if we become too dependent on genre mechanics, we might discourage developers from experimenting with new design ideas. Conversely, a willingness on our part to engage with new mechanics and systems might result in more ingenuity and variety in our games, and if that happens, we all win. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. And if you'd like to see more, just click the video thumbnails on the left. As always, see you next time on Belmont Boy.